Hi, hello everyone. So welcome to the CFPR lunchtime webinar series. So today is our great pleasure to welcome Professor Roita Mujiyama from Gakushuin University in Japan to give us an interesting presentation. So before we start, let me briefly introduce our speaker today. Our speaker, Professor Roita, is a sociologist and associate professor in Gakushuin University, and his research interests focus on labor market inequality, family formation, and social mobility. His research has been published in many leading international journals, such as European Sociological Review, Social Science Research, Research in Social Stratification and Mobility. And his topic today is very interesting, is about expanding socioeconomic inequality in access to remote work after COVID-19 in Japan. So let's welcome our speaker. Yeah, please.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Sanfu, for that wonderful introduction. As introduced, I am Ryota. I'm Ryota Mugiyama from Gakushuin University, Japan. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about our ongoing research. This study is actually a collaborative work with my colleague Kyoko Komatsu, and also this work is now in the stage of revise and resubmit. So we would love to hear any comments, suggestions, ideas for future research, or anything from you all. I have slightly divided the title of a talk, but the content is not different from the original one. I am going to talk about how access to remote work has increased between before and after the pandemic, and how the change is stratified based on workers' socioeconomic status, such as especially class and education. As you all know, during the COVID-19 pandemic, many people have become involved in remote work, such as telework or working from home. This expansion of remote work is also reflected in this type of seminar, where we can attend the seminar across the ocean from Japan and from Singapore or from other regions. Also, many workers have also become work from home or outside their traditional office. So it is receiving much attention around the world on how much a surge in remote work during the pandemic continue and takes hold beyond the pandemic. During the COVID-19 pandemic, it has been argued to expand workers' access to remote work, leading to fundamental changes in work styles or labor market or other kind of thing. In this study, we particularly focus on access to remote work, defined as the availability of remote work options through workplace policies. For example, if an employee is eligible for remote work policies in their workplace, it means that they can choose where they work. So this kind of options gives employees control over their own work and also provides work-life flexibility, and similar to other flexible work arrangements such as flex time. And access to remote work is also distinguished from the use of the engagement, which indicates the actual participation of employees in remote work. And also access and engagement is similar, but not be consistent, because during the pandemic, many people worked from home despite their workplace policies due to strict lockdowns or government mandates to reduce face-to-face interactions. And so if the increase in remote work engagement was just a temporary response rather than a permanent structural change, we cannot say that access to remote work has increased. But on the other hand, if the spike in engagement influenced employers and also employees' recognition of the potential or the benefit of remote work and was institutionalized as workplace policy, we can say access may have become more prevalent beyond the pandemic. So we should rely on the access to remote work. Before the pandemic, access to remote work was unevenly distributed across socioeconomic positions. More advantaged workers, such as professional, managerial, or highly educated workers, are more likely to have access to remote work than their less advantaged counterparts, similar to other flexible work arrangements. As I will see later, such differences may reflect many factors, including status, bargaining power, organizational characteristics, or task differences. If increased access to remote work after the pandemic is more concentrated among workers in higher socioeconomic positions, this could exacerbate pre-pandemic labor market inequality or stratification. In response to the pandemic, many researchers analyzed the remote work engagement and the socioeconomic inequality. These studies have shown that workers in lower socioeconomic positions are less likely to engage in remote work. One of the reasons is that they perform fewer or less teleworkable tasks, which involve such as manual tasks, physical interactions, less ICT, and so on. Such task differences lead to their lower engagement in remote work. Of course, these studies are important, but important and provide some insights into access to remote work. However, as we know, there is no direct evidence on how access to remote work and its socioeconomic gaps changed after the pandemic. Based on this background, we aim to examine how socioeconomic gaps, specifically focusing on class and education gaps in access to remote work, have evolved from January 2020 to 2023. To solve this, we use the variable panel survey data in Japan, which collects the information on remote work in the web survey that started before the COVID-19 and has been kept on conducting in the same period, in the same method. So this allows us to measure the precise changes in access to remote work over the period. And further, we isolate the sources of change in the socioeconomic gap in feasibility measured by tasks, as suggested by studies during the pandemic, and remained factors. And also, as a complement, we also examine the use of remote work to see if the increased access is being translated into behavior. Studies suggest that the use of remote work may be discouraged by the flexibility stigma, that the use of flexible work policies such as remote work is a negative signal of lower commitment. This may be particularly apparent in Japan, or where the ideal worker norm is strong and also overtime is prevalent. Okay, and let me introduce the situation of COVID-19 and remote work in Japan. This is the trends in confirmed death cases from COVID-19. At the beginning of the outbreak, the government announced its first state of emergency in April 2020, shown in the red shaded areas like this. And the government urged people to stay home, encouraged people to work from home, and requested retail stores to close and reduce operating hours. And the state of emergency was lifted in May, but subsequent waves peaked, leading to additional declarations of state of emergency in January, April, and July 2021. By September 2021, all states of emergency had been lifted, aided by progress in vaccination. And during these periods, there was no mandated lockdowns in Japan. This is a distinctive feature compared to other countries. And finally, COVID-19 was downgraded to the same level as seasonal flu in May 2023, signaling the official end of the pandemic in Japan. And the COVID-19 outbreak accelerated the adoption of remote work in Japan. Before the pandemic, the Japanese government set targets to encourage private companies to introduce remote work policies by offering financial support, aiming to improve the work-family balance and also increase productivity. However, the prevalence of access to and use of remote work in Japan remained relatively low compared to other high-income countries. But during the pandemic, the government strongly encouraged companies to adopt remote work. For example, in April 2020, the government requested to reduce the employees' office attendance by 70% compared to before the COVID, utilizing remote work. This led to a rapid increase in engagement in remote work. And during these periods, many companies have institutionalized remote work as their workplace policies beyond the short-time responses to the pandemic. Okay, how about the relationship between socioeconomic status? Prior to the pandemic, studies have shown that workers' access to remote work is linked to their socioeconomic status. Employers provide access to remote work or other flexible work arrangements based on productivity concerns rather than the work-family demands of the employees. In general, employers are reluctant to allow remote work because it reduces the visibility of employee performance. However, higher status or skilled workers are more likely to be expected by their own employers to increase productivity by using or utilizing greater access to flexible work arrangements as the privilege, resulting in their greater access. In addition, worker segregation between organizations is also an important source. For example, prestigious organizations adopt flexible work arrangements to gain positive social recognition from the public. And financially, they can also pay administrative or infrastructure costs for providing remote work arrangements. Against these backgrounds, when higher status or higher skilled workers are more likely to be employed in organizations with higher profits or prestige, it leads to their greater access to remote work or other flexible work arrangements. Oops. Okay. As a measure of socioeconomic position, we use worker class and we focus on class and education attainment. As you all know, these are stylized popular measure of socioeconomic status. And the first one is class, which is measured as occupational position. Occupational class is directly related to their workers' own daily work activities. The class theory also argues that class is determined by skill, specificity, and monitoring difficulty. Employers cannot monitor the products of highly skilled workers, such as professional and managerial workers, due to their very high skill. So in addition, such workers have greater bargaining power with their employers. As a result, employers will provide more access to remote work to higher class workers. Education is another important dimension of socioeconomic positions. Educational credentials function as signals of higher skills or status that employers trust. Education serves even among within the same class, as more educated workers can show their higher competence based on their qualification of education. Using this information, employers may also provide access to remote work for those who have higher educated qualifications. In addition, class or education are also associated with organizational segregation or placement, which also link to the differences in the access to remote work. At the same time, socioeconomic status is closely related to their differences in tasks. During the pandemic, many studies have argued that the feasibility of tasks for teleworking determines the extent to which workers can work from home. And the seminal paper by Dingell and Nyman 2020 argues that those with less manual or outdoor work, less physical interaction with others, and more use of ICT can work remotely. And based on this information, they estimated that almost 1/3 of workers employed in the US can do their own work from home. Other studies also examine the task characteristics associated with potential for remote work. For example, non-routine and cognitive tasks and tasks with greater decision-making latitude are more likely to be performed remotely. And also, we can speculate that higher class and more educated workers tend to perform these kinds of tasks that are teleworkable. So they were more likely to be engaged in work from home during the pandemic. Okay, based on these arguments, we extend the literature to changes in the socioeconomic gap in access to remote work before and after COVID-19. First, we expect that the pandemic accelerated the adoption of remote work policies in the workplace. Both employers and employees realized the potential and benefits of remote work through the shock of the pandemic. As the demand for remote work increases, employers will prioritize higher skilled or high status workers. So we hypothesize that higher class or more educated workers gain greater access to remote work after the COVID-19 outbreak than their lower class and less educated counterparts. The task feasibility arguments also suggest that remote work engagement has become more prevalent among those engaged in tasks suitable for remote work. And employers will also provide more access for those engaged in teleworkable tasks. In addition, such tasks are conducted by higher class or highly educated workers. Considering this relationship, we can expect that the increased gap in access to remote work by class and education will be accounted for by their task differences. Okay, so let me start with the methods of the study. We used the data from the Japanese panel study of employment dynamics, which was collected through web surveys in January 2020, January 2021, January 2022, and 2023. The survey originally began in January 2016 and has been conducted annually by the RecruitWorks Institute. The sample is designed to reflect the composition of the labor force survey conducted by Statistics Bureau of Japan to ensure representative coverage of the population. Also, the sample is replenished each survey period. Our analytical sample includes employed workers who aged between 25 and 64 who provided a varied response to the January 2020 survey and at least one another period to compare the difference between before the pandemic and after the pandemic. We excluded self-employed workers, and after removing observation with some missing values, the resultant sample size is 25,680 individuals with more than 84,000 personnel observations. So we can say the sample size is sufficient to examine that. The main focal dependent variables is access to remote work. The survey asks respondents as of last December, this is one month before the survey timing, was a remote work policy implemented in your workplace? Additionally, were you eligible under that policy? With 4 options. First, it was implemented as a policy and applied to me. And second, it was implemented as a policy that not applied to me. And third, it was not implemented as a policy. And fourth, do not know. We coded the first option as 1, indicating accessible to remote work, and otherwise coded it as 0. The survey also asks how many hours per week respondents work remotely. Using this information, we coded 1 if respondents worked remotely at least 1 hour per week and also had access to remote work, and otherwise 0. So those who work remotely without the formal workplace policy are not considered to be using remote work in this definition. Workers' socioeconomic position is measured by their class and educational attainment. Regarding class, following EGP class schema, we classified workers' class into 5 categories, excluding self-employed workers. The first, the high professional and managerials, and second, lower professional and managerials, and third, higher routine manuals, which typically includes administrative or commerce workers, and fourth, lower routine manuals, which typically includes sales and service workers, and other manual workers. Educational attainment is measured by the last educational institution respondents finished as of 2020. This is classified into 5 groups from junior high, high school, junior college, university, and graduate school degree. The survey also asks respondents about the work they do. We use this information to construct several task characteristics. For instance, the non-routine task scale, the cognitive task scale, and the independent task scale, ranging from 0 to 100. We also take into account other task characteristics, such as task variety, influencing others, and decision attitude. All of these task measures are standardized to have a mean of 0 and a variance of 1 to compare different scale of the variables. In addition, we matched respondents' occupational code with the Japanese version of the Occupational Information Network database, job tag, to construct occupational level task characteristics. This database was released by the Japanese government in 2020, which aims to provide useful occupational information for job seekers. This database replicates original US ONET and collects similar occupational measures by translating them into Japanese wording. Using this occupational information, we constructed various occupational level task characteristics. Specifically, following the previous studies, Dingel and Nyman and other studies that measure teleworkability index from using the US ONET, we constructed 3 occupational level task measures. The first is physical and external work conditions, which is the composite measure of these Japanese ONET items, such as performing general physical activities, working or running, or exposure to disease or infection or such kind of items. The second is social interaction, including contacts with other people in public spaces and dealing with violent people. And the third one is use of communication technology measured by the frequency of use of email. These variables are also standardized to mean 0 and variance 1, similar to the individual level task characteristics. We use fixed effects linear probability models to measure the differences in the percentage change in access to or use of remote work compared to pre-COVID period by class and education. In model 1, we predict the value of access to remote work or use of remote work by the independent variable class, the interaction with survey period, D, the interaction between education and survey period. The main effect of education is omitted because we control the individual fixed effect. And the time varying control variables, including age, residential area, industry and farm size, and the interaction with survey period, the individual fixed effect, and the period fixed effect, and other error terms. The focal parameter is beta 2 and beta 3, which measure the differences in change in each class or education group relative to the reference counterparts. The positive coefficients indicates that the greater increase after the COVID-19 compared to the reference group. So this model captures the overall change in class or education gap in access to or use of remote work. In model 2, we introduce 9 task measures I explained before and the interaction with survey period. So this model allows us to see the extent to which the task-related expansion of remote work accounts for the change in the socioeconomic gap after the pandemic. Okay, now let's see the results. These figures show the trends in the proportion of access to and use of remote work between January 2020 and 2023. We can see that access to remote work increases over time. In January 2020, just before the pandemic, only 4.8% of employees are entitled to remote work. This proportion increased to 16.7% in January 2021, and then reached almost 20% in January 2023. And as access increased, so did the use of remote work. The share was only 2.5% in January 2020. However, it increased to finally 13.4% in January 2023, indicating that the more people become engaged in remote work using the formal workplace policies of remote work. So we can see that access to remote work substantially increased after the COVID-19 outbreak, and the expansion remains after the period. Then let's look at the trends by class. These figures show that access to remote work increased unevenly by class. For example, before the pandemic, 10% of higher professional managerial workers had access to remote work, compared with less than 2% of manual workers or lower routine or manual workers. The proportion of higher professional managerial workers with access to remote work increased to 35% in 2021 and continued to increase in subsequent years. On the other hand, those of manual workers or lower routine or manual workers remained quite low throughout the period. The class gap in use of remote work also follows this trend, with greater increases among professional workers, professional managerial workers, or higher routine or manual workers compared to other classes. We can also see the uneven trends by education. Higher educated workers increased access to remote work greater than their less counterparts. For example, for the most educated group, graduate school graduates, the proportion increased from about 15% to about 50% in January 2023. University graduates also increased access significantly. In contrast, the less educated groups, such as junior high school graduates or high school graduates, see only a small increase. The increasing education gap in use of remote work is relatively modest, but still a larger increase in use, particularly for highly educated workers. The task differences may be related to these trends. So to see associations between class or education and tasks, we estimated the linear regression models predicting each task by class and education, net of other controls. Sorry for the small letter, but regarding class, professional and managerial workers are generally less engaged in tasks involving physical and external work and social interaction, while they are more engaged in tasks involving use of communication technology, greater use of communication technology, non-routine tasks, and cognitive tasks, and greater variety of tasks, and influencing others, and greater decision latitude than the reference group manual workers. In addition, controlling for class education attainment is also associated with their tasks. Highly educated workers are more likely to be engaged in tasks that involve greater use of communication technology, non-routine tasks, cognitive tasks, greater variety of tasks, and influencing others. But also, in general, the strength of the association between class and tasks is stronger than that between education and tasks. This is reasonable because class is more directly related to data.
Sorry, everyone. So seems that our speaker is disconnected, and we're trying to connect him as soon as possible.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
The point is that the class is strongly associated with tasks than workers' own educational attainment. Okay, so now we move on to the main fixed effect results. And this figure shows the percentage point changes in access to remote work from January 2020, controlling for other variables, but not for tasks. We can see that higher class workers gained greater access during this period. Particularly, higher professional and managerial workers experienced the largest increase in access relative to the manual class, with an 18-point increase between 2020 and 2021. And the increased gap remained stable and even increased in subsequent periods. So we can conclude that the class gap in access to remote work significantly increased after the COVID-19. But this model does not control for tasks. So next, we want to see if task differences explain the increased gap. By controlling for tasks in Model 2, the increased class gap significantly reduces. The increased class gap remains significant in Model 2, but the magnitude is smaller than in Model 1. So the results are consistent with a hypothesis, which suggests that the observed increase in class gap in access to remote work shown in Model 1 is largely accounted for by their task differences. However, we can also see that the task cannot account for the entire increase in the class gap in access to remote work. So what about the education gap? The results show that the educational gap in access to remote work has also increased between January 2020 and 2021. Highly educated workers gained more access to remote work than their lower counterparts, and the increased gap almost stable across these periods. The increase in education gap remains at about the same level throughout the period. Different from the class gap, the increased education gap in access is not accounted for by tasks. The increased access for highly educated workers remained significant in Model 2, with coefficients not much different from those in Model 1. So this suggests that task differences across educational groups, net of class or other related factors do not play a major role in the increased educational gap in access to remote work. We also estimated the same models for use of remote work. These figures show the results. Then overall, the results for use of remote work are very similar to the results for access to remote work. So increased class or education gap and the increased class gap is explained by the task differences, but the increased education gap is not accounted for the differences in tasks. Okay, I would like to skip this slide. And we conducted several robustness checks, for example, using the alternative measure of access to remote work. For example, we defined the implemented and applied to me as a full access, and it was implemented but not applied to me as a partial access, and it was not implemented and do not know coded as 0, and using this as a dependent variable. And also, we use the alternative measure of use of remote work, such as those who work remotely at least 20% of their weekly working hours as 1, and otherwise 0. And also the proportion of hours worked remotely as a continuous variable, ranging from 0 to 1. But overall, these results are substantially similar to the main results. We also conducted the various robustness checks, such as analyzing those who are continuously employed throughout the 4-year periods and without changing employers, or using the survey attrition rate, and also measuring workers' class as of January 2020, rather than the time-varying variable. And also, we try to exclude the short-time worker by removing those who worked less than 20 hours per week, but the results are not different from the main results. So we can conclude that the results, such as the increased class or education gap, are quite robust. Okay, so now let me conclude. We have examined how the class and education gap in access to remote work has changed after the COVID-19 and the source of the changes by taking task characteristics into account. So first, we found that the class and education gap in access expanded after the COVID-19 outbreak, with higher class and more educated workers gaining access, which lead to their actual use. This is our first major contribution to the literature, showing that remote work has become more institutionalized after COVID-19 beyond the temporal response to the pandemic, but with socioeconomic differentials. We also showed that task feasibility of remote work played some role in the increased socioeconomic gap in access, but it is not the whole story. For the class gap, the increased gap is largely accounted for by the task differences, but the education gap in access cannot be accounted for such differences. And so these results suggest that factors different from tasks also contributed to the uneven expansion of access to remote work after COVID-19, suggesting increased socioeconomic inequality. We can speculate some other forces, such as employers may have given greater access to higher class or highly educated workers because employers see them as competent or trustworthy, or larger or prestigious organizations that employ more highly skilled workers may have actively implemented remote work policies. But to disentangle these kind of forces remained as a future research theme. Overall, we found that the socioeconomic inequality in access to remote work increased after the COVID-19, and we believe that these trends will be somewhat applicable to other countries from Japan, particularly where remote work was institutionalized through the pandemic. Of course, we need to investigate it in the future. And finally, there are some possible future directions. For example, it would be important to track the subsequent trends, whether the gap further increased or decreased after the January 2023. And also, studies have suggested that greater access to remote work provides workers resources to deal with their stress, increasing their well-being. So the consequences on well-being or other outcomes would be another important research theme. And also, we should learn more about the country differences. Okay, and sorry for the connection trouble, but anyway, that's all for my presentation. Thank you
Yeah.
for your attention.
No worries. Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I think everyone has learned a lot. So, any questions? Yeah. So, Wushu, please. Yeah.
Sorry, you are muted.
Sorry, I was
Okay.
muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Mukiyama. It's very informative to me. I learned a lot. I have two questions. The first question is about so I noticed in the descriptive results you have shared, the gap between access to remote work and use of remote work appears to be largest among the highly educated groups and among those in the highest occupational group, the higher professionals. I'm wondering why this is the case. And earlier in the literature review, you talked about something like flexibility stigma. I wonder if this could help explain this larger gap between access and use, actual use of remote work. My second question is I'm wondering, have you looked at the gender patterns? Whether there's a gender interaction with education or with class in terms and the outcome variables. And in the robustness checks, one of the robustness checks you did, you excluded those working less than 20 hours, right? So I'm wondering, does the results differ significantly? Considering that, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but I mean gender gaps in terms of employment trajectories, whether it's a regular trajectory or the non-regular trajectory with lower promotion opportunities for women in Japan and more women concentrating in part-time work, whether it's still the case and whether these gender patterns show up in your research. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your very important comment. Yes, regarding the first point, I also suspect that the kind of flexibility stigma reduces creates the gap between access to remote work and use of remote work, particularly the upper class or upper class workers. And regarding the lower class workers, there are almost no I would say no options to utilize the remote work policies because the net proportion of access to remote work is very low, so that almost the value is similar. But the higher class workers or highly educated workers, the access is very high compared to the lower group. So some of them may be reluctant to use the remote work, even they can have access to remote work. Yeah, of course, this is one of the speculation. So we have to directly examine whether such kind of stigma is or not. And thanks. And also, second point is that also important. We check the gender differences by separating the sample between men and women. The trend is almost similar, but the net difference regarding men and women, women are less likely to be entitled to remote work policies compared to men, even after controlling class or education. So it may we can found that women in general are less likely to be entitled to remote work policies. One of the reasons may be related to your comments, like for example, the non-regular or non-standard. Women are more likely to be employed in non-regular or non-standard or short-time, part-time employment, and employers are less likely to give access to remote work, such kind of employment types. So women are less likely to have the access. So it would be one of the important the future direction to disentangle the gender differences or the relationship between type of employment contracts and so on. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for your comment.
Okay, and Wu Zheng, please. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for this very interesting talk. I learned a lot. So actually, I have a question regarding the internal heterogeneity among remote work. And so I noticed that you have also like used individual level measures of the tasks done for like all the respondents in the sample. So I'm wondering, like, to what extent it's also possible, say, have some occupation level measures regarding tasks done. And then, for example, you can further divide remote work into different types. Some of them like require more creative skills, and other like are more communication skills and so on. And then predict the socioeconomic diversity across like what kind of like remote jobs is more divided across different socioeconomic status. At the time, I see that you have first of all, like predict the socioeconomic differences in these different tasks done, and also controlled the tasks as a mediating process. But I'm thinking that if this outcome can be like further divided, and then I think it's clearer that what is exactly dividing among these different social classes. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, actually we can construct multiple or other kind of tasks, such as the creative tasks or programming or other kinds of thing. Of course, we have such kind of occupational level information, but currently we have not introduced that kind of information. But it would be very important to predict who are entitled to access or who can use the remote work. Probably programming or kind of programming or creative jobs are suitable for work from home. So it will be very, very important. So I will do that kind of analysis in the future.
Thank you.
Like that. Thank you.
Yeah. So I also have some questions. Yeah, so it's very interesting to show that different socioeconomic groups, they have a different kind of tasks. And we find some tasks are more strongly correlated with occupational class, and they play a mediating role. So my question is, which tasks plays a more important role than others in explaining the occupational differences?
Okay, great. Thank you. Actually, I skipped that part because of the time issue. But anyway, there is another important point. Yeah, there are 3 or 4 types of tasks important role to mediating the relationship, particularly the less social interaction, use of communication technology, and non-routine tasks and cognitive tasks. The higher class workers are more likely to be engaged in that kind of non-routine or cognitive task, and also with greater use of communication technology and less physical interaction with others. And these kind of task differences mediates more than other kind of tasks. The differences of in terms of the differences of the access or use of remote work. Yeah, these kind of tasks are important.
Okay, yeah, okay. Thanks so much. Yeah. So yeah, and I'm also wondering, uh, for example, we find among those who have access to remote working, and actually, majority of them actually use it during the COVID-19, but not all of them. So actually, it would be interesting to me to kind of explore maybe in the future to look at among those who have access to remote working and who are able to actually use it and who may not able to use it. Maybe probably due to the fear of losing opportunity to get promotion or any other reasons. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to explore who are able to actually use it and who cannot. Yeah.
Yeah. Great, thank you. That is also a very important, also interesting point. Yeah, we also suspect that the mismatch between access and use partly reflects the flexibility stigma, and others reflects the personal preference. Some people prefer to work at the office than from the home. So it would anyway, we should examine more that why and who are mismatched, even if they entitled to remote work, but they cannot use. Yeah, it would be also important and interesting, I think. Yeah,
that would be great. Yeah. And I also want to ask, for example, in your survey, whether you have other variables of other types of flexible working, for example, flexible time or flexible schedule. And it would be also interesting to look at socioeconomic inequality in access or use of other kinds of flexible working arrangement or the combination of different type of flexible working arrangement.
Okay, great. Thank you. Actually, the survey collects the other kind of flexible work arrangements, such as the flex time and the short time work, or other kind of such kind of flexible work arrangement is collected. And actually, the most important, the most greater difference is in the remote work, of course, but the flex time or short time work or other kind or flex schedule, such kind of thing, it will be also interesting to see the differences or socioeconomic differences of that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so this is all my questions. So any other questions from other audience? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, if no, I think now we are exactly on time. And if there are no questions, please join me to thank our speaker, Professor Reuter, today for his very interesting presentation. Yeah, thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, thank you everyone and have a nice weekend again.
Yeah, great. Thank you.